My mother-in-law told the county emergency management director that she was the one who taught me how to work a radio, so I let her have the microphone right up until he asked to see the logbook I still had zipped in my jacket pocket. I bought my first handheld radio the week after a spring storm missed our subdivision by 4 streets and took the roof off a daycare instead. I was 26, newly married, and badly shaken by how little warning any of us had actually gotten. A neighbor down the block, a retired lineman named Hoyt, had been on the air that whole night relaying reports to the sheriff's dispatch before the sirens even sounded. I asked him to teach me. He said the first thing I needed wasn't a radio, it was a license, and the second thing I needed was patience because nobody hands a stranger the airwaves during a storm until they've proven they know the rules cold. I studied for my technician license at my kitchen table for 2 months, then drove 40 minutes to sit the exam in the back room of a hardware store with 4 other people, none of them under 50. I passed. Hoyt signed off on my first real radio purchase, a used mobile unit from a man whose wife made him get rid of his shack junk, and my late father, who never once said he understood what I was doing but always wanted to be involved anyway, paid for half of it without telling me until the receipt showed up folded into my birthday card. I still have that receipt. I have kept every receipt, every log sheet, every certificate since, in a battered spiral logbook that started as a legal requirement and became something closer to a diary. My husband Dale's mother, Carol, decided early on that my radio hobby was a phase and an unflattering one. She made comments at dinner about how it wasn't a woman's place to be barking codes into a box at midnight, and she especially disliked that Dale sometimes drove me to spotter trainings instead of spending that Saturday with her. She asked me once, in front of his whole side of the family, whether I planned to grow out of the antenna thing before we had kids, as if a call sign were a stage a person aged past. For the first 2 years she mostly ignored the whole thing the way she ignored anything she hadn't personally approved of in advance, which in Carol's house covered a surprising amount of ground. That changed once the county started noticing. Hoyt got older and stepped back from net control, the volunteer role that runs the actual radio traffic during a warning, and the emergency management office asked me to take it over. I spent a year recruiting other operators, running practice nets every Tuesday night, and building out a real reporting structure so that when a wall cloud dropped a funnel over the west side of the county, 31 different spotters knew exactly who to call and in what order. It worked. It worked well enough that the sheriff's office started crediting our reports by name in their public briefings. That was when Carol started telling a different story. At my cousin's baby shower, I overheard her explaining to a table of women that her own father had been on the radios in the war and that she'd always known I would take to it, since she practically raised me on those stories. I had never heard a single one of those stories before that afternoon. Dale's father had never mentioned a father-in-law who served, let alone one who ran radios. I let it go. It was a shower, not a courtroom. It kept happening. At Thanksgiving, Carol told Dale's uncle that she was the one who'd found my first radio at an estate sale and talked the seller down on price. That radio came from Hoyt's friend, cash, no haggling, and Carol had never been in the same room as that transaction. 2 weeks after that, at a birthday dinner for Dale's cousin, I heard her tell a new girlfriend of his, a stranger to all of us, that she'd sat up with me on the air more nights than I could count during my first storm season, back when in reality she wouldn't let Dale so much as mention the radio at her table. I started, without really deciding to, keeping a second kind of log. Not the FCC-required kind. Screenshots of texts, a note in my phone with the date and exact wording of what she'd said and to whom, the way you'd log a contact you didn't trust to remember accurately on its own. The county's Volunteer of the Year ceremony was announced in March, and my name was on the shortlist for the Emergency Communications Award, the first time it had gone to someone under 40. The local paper called to set up an interview. Before I could return the call, Carol called the reporter herself, introduced herself as the family radio operator who got her into all this, and gave a 20-minute interview about her father's wartime service and how she put the first radio in my hands. The reporter, to his credit, called me afterward to fact-check. I answered every question with the same flat, factual tone Hoyt had taught me to use on the air, no editorializing, just what happened, when. I didn't confront Carol. Dale offered to, and I told him not to, because I didn't want this to become a fight about her feelings instead of a fight about the truth, and because I already knew exactly how I planned to handle it. I photographed every page of my logbook that mattered: the license exam date, the receipt from the estate sale with my father's handwriting on the memo line, the roster from my very first practice net, 2 full years before Carol claims she always knew. I put the photographs in order. I did not confront anyone. I waited. 3 weeks before the ceremony, the worst storm cell of the season formed almost directly over the county line at 8 in the evening, a fast-moving supercell that the regional forecast office was still refining warnings on in real time. I was already at the radio when the first tornado warning went out, running net control from my kitchen table with Dale beside me relaying updates from the weather radio. Reports started coming in from 4 different directions inside of 6 minutes. Carol, who had gotten it into her head over the preceding weeks that she was practically a co-founder of the Spotter Net, showed up at Dale's parents' house that same evening and, without a license, without training, and without asking anyone, keyed up on a handheld radio Dale's father kept in a kitchen drawer and started transmitting on our operating frequency, asking where the funnel thing was so she could help. She stepped on an active report from a spotter watching a wall cloud rotate 2 miles from a trailer park, garbling it into silence for 11 full seconds at the exact moment he was giving a bearing and distance. I recognized her voice immediately and broke in with the calmest, flattest net control voice I had, telling her to clear the frequency now, repeating it twice, then acknowledging the spotter and asking him to repeat his last transmission. He did. The rotation held together for another 4 minutes before lifting. No touchdown, no injuries, but I logged the interruption anyway, time-stamped, with her call sign field left blank because she didn't have one to write down. It was the first time in 3 years of net control I had ever had to clear an unlicensed operator off the air, and I did not enjoy a single second of it. Dale heard the whole exchange over the radio and drove to his parents' house that night, quietly, without raising his voice, and told his mother she was never to touch that radio again. She cried and said she'd only been trying to help. I believed that she believed it. It didn't change what the recording of that frequency showed, and county emergency management radios are logged automatically, whether Carol remembered that detail or not. The ceremony was held in the community center gymnasium, folding chairs and a portable podium. The county emergency management director at the microphone with a laminated certificate and a plaque with my name misspelled in the first print run and corrected in the second. Dale sat in the front row. Carol sat 1 seat over from him, in a blazer I hadn't seen before, and asked the director beforehand, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear, whether the family would get a chance to say a few words before the recipient did. He said of course, not realizing what he was agreeing to, and Carol was at the microphone before my name was even fully out of his mouth. She thanked the county for recognizing a tradition that started with my own father's radio service and said she was proud to have put that very first radio in her hands and prouder still to have been there on the air with her the night it counted. She said this in a gymnasium full of the exact operators who had been on that net with me for 3 years and knew precisely who had cleared an unlicensed transmission off an active tornado report 3 weeks earlier. I walked up when she stepped back, thanked the director, and said I did want to say a few words about how this award actually came together, because the record deserved to be accurate. I opened my jacket pocket and took out the logbook and set beside it the folded, faded receipt with my late father's handwriting on the memo line, dated 4 years before that night, 2 years before Carol says she found that same radio at an estate sale. I read the roster from my very first practice net, names and call signs, dated a full 2 years before Carol's shower story about always knowing I'd take to it. Then I read, without raising my voice, the time-stamped log entry from 3 weeks earlier, unlicensed transmission on the operating frequency, 11 seconds of interference on an active tornado report, cleared by net control. I didn't say her name. The county already had her name on file because the interference had been logged automatically by the same system that logged everyone else's transmissions that night, and the director's own staff had pulled the tape 2 days earlier when I'd quietly asked them to confirm the timestamp for my own records. The room went very still in the specific way a room goes still when it already suspects the truth and is only waiting for someone to say it plainly. A few of the operators in the back rows, the ones who'd been on that net with me the night of the interference, weren't quiet at all. Hoyt let out a short, sharp laugh he tried and failed to swallow, and somebody near the folding table coffee urn said finally, just loud enough to carry. The director thanked me, said the county's records matched what I'd read word for word, and asked, on the record, whether the family remarks needed any correction for the write-up going in next month's newsletter. Carol said no, very quietly, and sat back down without looking at anyone. Dale didn't say much on the drive home. He held my hand at a red light and said he was sorry it had taken him this long to actually see it happen instead of just hearing about it secondhand. Sorry too for every time he'd let one of her stories pass at a dinner table because correcting his mother in front of company had always felt like the harder, meaner option. I told him I hadn't done it for him to see it. I'd done it because for 3 years I had been the person other people's safety depended on during the worst 6 minutes of a bad night, and I was not going to let anyone rewrite that record standing at a podium 2 feet away from the actual log. Carol called a week later, not to apologize exactly, but to ask whether I still had that notebook thing, phrased like it was a novelty rather than a legal requirement I'd kept faithfully since a hardware store back room 4 years earlier. I told her I did and that I intended to keep keeping it. She didn't bring up her father's wartime radio service again, not at the next holiday, not at the one after that. Hoyt, when I told him the story at the following Tuesday practice net, laughed for a long time and then told me that was, without question, the best use of a logbook he'd heard of in 40 years on the air. The plaque hangs in the room where the radio sits now, next to the framed receipt with my father's handwriting, and the logbook lives in the drawer underneath both of them, still getting a new entry every Tuesday night, exactly the way it has since the week I decided that if nobody else was going to keep an accurate record of what actually happened,